Christ is among us. Christ is among us. He always will be. This is Father Demetrius Nikolodakis from St. Matthew's Greek Orthodox Church, Landon, Pennsylvania, just outside of Reading. And just wanted to share with you some thoughts regarding the gospel reading and the epistle recently done for the fourth Sunday of St. Matthew, the fourth Sunday following Pentecost. And the gospel especially, I think, keys us into some issues that we're even dealing with right now. The story with Jesus and having a Roman centurion come to him to ask him to heal his servant who he probably felt so close to, like it was a child of his. So I'm going to read you the story and I'll go from that into this reality here. In that kairos, in that time, where eternity breaks into time, I should say. That's what kairos means theologically speaking. When Jesus entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. "Lord," he said, "my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly." Jesus says to him, "Shall I come and heal him?" The centurion replies, "Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. But just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, 'Go,' and he goes, and that one, 'Come,' and he comes. I say to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed and said to those following him, "Truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you, many will come from east and west, and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown out into the darkness, where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Then Jesus says to the centurion, "Go, let it be done as you have believed it would." And his servant was healed at that moment. I think the context makes the story more powerful if we understand the background in all this. In Palestine at the time, the occupation by the Romans was pretty severe because it was a province. So not many of the people were Roman citizens. Most of them were what they would call provincials. And in the process of all that, it was probably tantamount to the way many of the people in Europe, especially Southern Europe, who were swarthy and not as Aryan looking as those of Northern and Western Europe, would have been seen as of a lower class, a lower level, and so on and so forth. And how the Romans would have related, we know this, and this is why tax collectors were hated, was precisely because of the reality that you worked as a Jew, for example, taxing not only your own people for this government, which did provide some wonderful things in terms of roads and other benefits on one level, but on the other level, it was difficult because if you did not pay your taxes, unlike the IRS today, you actually could have your spouse, your children taken away into slavery. Roman soldiers could come to your house anytime they desired, take food, take whatever, and so on and so forth, and not be liable. If you were arrested on a capital offense, the execution would be of the severest possible, which is why crucifixions were so common in Palestine. If you're a Roman citizen, you could at least ask for decapitation in that way, which was a lot quicker than hanging on a cross for a day or two. So this situation now where Jesus has a Roman centurion come to him, and a centurion, especially of this level, because there were different levels of centurion, but the fact that he has a household and so on and so forth says he's of an upper level where he can afford a whole household and so forth. It's like having a full bird colonel, for those of you who've been in the military, understanding what that means in terms of rank, someone who's just a step below a general. But imagine a Nazi colonel coming to you in the land that is occupied by them. And the Nazis, as we know, were very brutal, especially to the peoples in those areas. Children as well as adults could be taken for reprisals. It was pretty horrific under the regime under the Nazis. But anyway, a full-bird Nazi colonel comes and says to Jesus about his servant that he loves a great deal, that he's paralyzed, is suffering terribly, and would he heal him? And Jesus makes an amazing statement, shall I come? I mean, come to his house, because obviously the servant isn't going to be moved. The servant isn't going to be moved. Shall I come? Now, you have to understand again in the culture of the time that to go into somebody's house was a big deal, especially in Judaism. You could be spiritually defiled. You're going into the house of somebody who worships idols. They're pagans, basically. You're defiled, and you would have to go through ritual bathing in order to participate in any temple worship at the time. But Jesus actually offers, which was probably to the shock of the disciples, shall I come and heal him? And the response, of course, is mind-blowing as well, because the centurion understands something about God, God's sovereignty. The fact that he addresses Jesus even as Lord is very potent. Matthew doesn't say whether he was what was called a God-fearer, which were Gentiles who believed in the God of Israel, that he was the real God, etc., and followed their ways. They didn't just want to go, the males, that is, didn't want to go through that last little ritual. That was very painful to become fully a part of the community of Israel, the covenant community, I should say, of Israel. So that he addresses him, Lord, to begin with, is that this centurion recognizes something about Jesus. And Jesus must recognize something about him, that he's willing to humble himself. Now, this is a pretty big deal, that here's this Roman centurion who's coming to a Jew and asking for help. And that the rabbi even offers to come to the house, and no, you don't need to do that, because of what he recognizes in Jesus. And he apparently has an understanding about God, and this is why it's important. Is the idea of faith, the idea that I know how this works, this God that is worshipped, the God of Israel. When he wants something done, it's done. You know, I know just in the military, if I say go, somebody will go. If I say come, somebody comes. The same kind of thing. He goes, it's enough for you to just say it. It's enough for you to just say it. Now, that's a very powerful statement, especially, I think, in a world that we're very much dictated to by fear. Fear is a passion that is normal in some ways. It's a way to guard us on some levels, but sometimes we let it control us in irrational kinds of ways, where we want to go hide, dig a hole, and put ourselves into, and so on and so forth. This man has faith. This man has faith. In fact, to the point that Jesus says to the other disciples, now these are the people, disciple again being, you're in training. You're being apprenticed by Jesus to do what he does. And by the way, just a little sidebar, this is what kind of maybe jumpstarts the discussion later about Gentiles joining the covenant community of Israel reborn, aka the followers of Jesus. But anyway, with all that, I have not found so great a faith in all of Israel as this man. Very potent. Now, he's risking some things too. Can you imagine the razzing he's getting and even the pressure? Are you just following in with these Jews? What's going on? Da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And here you got a guy who they're calling Messiah, which politically is a very dangerous kind of thing. Because Messiah, when a Roman heard that, that was somebody who was going to liberate Israel from the oppressors, and they clearly understood, the Romans, how they were seen by Jews. So this guy who's claiming to be Messiah, this centurion comes to him for help. And he doesn't let his fear dissuade him from asking for help. His love for this servant is so great that he's willing to take the risk and trust, And I think that's very important. We know later in the book of Acts and the letters of St. Paul that there will be Christians in places where you don't expect them, or people who are open to, or followers of Jesus, among the temple staff in Jerusalem, even though it was the Sanhedrin that seemed to persecute the followers of Jesus, some of the priests especially, and so on and so forth. You also have Pharisees and priests who are becoming part of Israel reborn in the community of Jesus's followers. Paul talks about people of Caesar's household, his own guards, and so forth. And I think that's important because we tend to see things as such absolute black and white. And that's where fear gets us. Fear drives us to see everything in terms of black and white. I need it to be black and white for me to feel secure, for me to understand, for me to know what's going on. Well, it's not always absolute black and white. During the communist period in Russia and the Eastern Bloc countries, where many were taken to labor camps, prisons, and so on and so forth, they talk about secret Christians among some of the guards or some of the soldiers that they met in the process. In the East, we don't see things in terms of, like in the Reformed theology, of total depravity. The word total implies an absolute of some kind. The only absolute is God himself. The only absolute is God himself. Now, this isn't to, be okay about behaviors that are violent, hurtful, and so on and so forth, dehumanizing, depersonalizing other people. Scripture is clearly against those kinds of things. But to see that maybe things aren't as black and white, and we live in a world that we're afraid of everything now. Anything that has the word government must be bad. And I'm not saying we don't critique or investigate and discern, no question. Or anything that any company does because they're in it for the profit. There must be, everything in it must be totally bad. And we seem to swing these pendulums all over the place. All over the place. I know people who own health food stores who can be just as greedy as the guy in some big corporate office, selling cut rate foods and so forth. So we can't always make it everything absolute black and white. I'm not saying, again, we can't be discerning. Don't hear that. But the danger is for us to not see things through the eyes of Christ and see people first as people, that we jump to demonize people. One of the things that's very striking about the early church is while there were people often in adversarial positions towards the followers of Jesus, the followers of Jesus are never seen as being adversarial. They never see themselves as being adversarial to the rest of the world around them. Even in the 2nd century, the letters that are written to the emperors and so forth, just try to help them understand what this faith is. That, why are you persecuting us? And so on and so forth. We share everything, as one of the letters, the letter to Diognetus, a very famous letter by an unknown Christian, says we share everything with the world around us except our marital beds. We are there for all people. I mean, and that was one of the striking things about Christianity in general, is they not only supported and helped their co-religionists, they were there for people of all kinds of backgrounds that were in need. Because we saw people through the eyes of Jesus. We saw them as being in the image of God himself. And that in the incarnation, God has welded himself to every human being, whether they know it or not, or believe it or not. But he's there. He's there. The Holy Spirit is, in a sense, there, keeping them alive and existing. This isn't deism, like what I see in a lot of Christian expressions, where God somehow throws grace at us and winds us up and keeps us going. No, God is there actually animating every part of our life. He's directly present. He's not somewhere else. So understanding that in the church, there are no enemies. Wherever Jesus is, Jesus does not see people as enemies. We're talking about worshiping a guy on a cross who says, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. And that the followers understood this was the attitude. Like St. Stephen in Acts chapter 8, right? When he's being dragged by a frenzied, crazed mob to be killed. And seeing Jesus standing at God's right hand, which I won't go into, but part of it is expression of honoring what Stephen is doing, because he stands up like you would to honor somebody. But when he's taken out and being stoned and says, Lord, don't hold this against them. Not as just kind of some pious imagery or whatever, or metaphor. He's very serious. There are no enemies. There are no enemies as far as God is concerned. Now, there are people in adversarial positions, don't get me wrong, we can take the metaphors, the spiritual adversities and so on and so forth. But the point being how we look at every human being, how we look at each human being. And I think it's important to understand that, however, that fear plays a role in how we treat people. Not only fear of people who clearly display behaviors that are violent and so on and so forth, but fear of people that we don't know or we've had popular images thrown at us. I think it's fair to say that in our own parishes, there's ways we relate to people that are different from us. And again, I understand how when the immigrants first came here, they huddled together and the parishes were a place of safety. That when like my mother had experiences of the KKK, burning crosses, flying Confederate flags, because not simply because of the people of color in the community, but also these foreigners, these people that look like Catholics, and so on and so forth. They didn't want them. You're not American. You're not this. You're not that, et cetera, et cetera. Go back to where you came from. You're taking our jobs, blah, 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 and so forth. And actually frightening people that weren't of their kind, And even watching the transition as people of other racial, ethnic backgrounds were joining the church and slowly people accepting, but the fact that it was difficult to accept. Again, initially out of fear, not because everybody in these parishes were bad people, but fear. But then even dealing with people of color, forgetting in Africa that orthodoxy is a very strong presence. And having people come here, Americans who are of color coming to our churches, can be a real challenge. And not even just people of color, which I've seen people turn away from the church. I actually have been asked and disappointed in the response I get from the person asking that I had said that interracial marriage is not a sin. I'm not saying there's not challenges depending on your families, etc. But it isn't a sin. I'm sorry, it's not a sin. And a sin is not something that is totally absolute evil. A sin is anything that takes away from the full picture of who God is revealed through Jesus and lived in the life of the church in the way that God desires. Not the way we think church ought to be, but the way Jesus and the apostles and the communities thought and practiced how community should be. So, and even to the point that it's no longer even a person of color, a lot of times it is, as a priest friend of mine said once upon a time, where he was loving what St. Matthew says about in being a parish accepts people of all backgrounds, and no matter what their past struggles were with, and so on and so forth. And not that the predominant makeup of the church that, it's funny how we put labels on, again, out of fear, that because there's a couple people who once upon a time may have been incarcerated, there's a couple people who once upon a time struggled with addiction, whether it be alcohol or drugs of some kind, and have been sober now for a good bit of time. But nonetheless, you get that reputation. Oh my gosh, those people. You don't want to go to church there because, oh my God, they'll think you did drugs, you have been incarcerated, and things like that. The bias that plays out. Or the bias even, and this is where this priest friend of mine, I'm sorry, I digressed a bit with the story, when he was saying why he loved St. Matthew's, and at the time was pastoring a very large parish, most of the people very well-to-do. And he said, you have people of all these backgrounds, including people of color. And I said to him, Father, you have people of color in your parish. And he said, they're accepted because they're well-to-do people of color. So we all have biases on some level. And part of it is fear. We're afraid when something is unknown to us, if it isn't exactly like us. And you see, what's sad is we don't look whether or not we have Christ in common. Do we have Christ in common? The disciples of Jesus were probably freaking out watching this Roman centurion and probably some other soldiers with him walking up to Jesus where he's with his disciples. They didn't know what that meant. Back then, there could be arrest for random reasons. Due process was a lot more loose, especially if you were not a Roman citizen at the time. So it's pretty scary. Understand that. Fear, and so on and so forth. We don't know how people are going to react to us, and so forth. And fear, it's interesting. Fear becomes a cover for other issues in our lives. I remember learning when I was in my 20s from some very wise older men who were watching guys who had to overplay being macho and do, I mean, like really hyper macho. I'm not talking about enjoying or expressing, definitive traits that are seemingly more masculine, but at the same time, the overkill.